try to be aware every single moment of your thought, word, and actions. I think that's the simplest thing. Somebody is having a bad day, so they're going to react differently. It doesn't mean that we have to have a squabble as a result of that. We rarely have control over the trigger or the stressor. What we do have control over is how we respond to it. Pausing, thinking about something before you're trying to respond to it, or just stepping back from this driver's seat and saying, hey, you know what, Tim's having a rough day, so this is what it is. Or, you know what, Tim is being extra obnoxious today during this interview so that, he can push my buttons. As humans, we get a lot of information when we interact with somebody else. And putting that down as a number doesn't do justice to it.
We are live on the Objective Hiring Show. Today we're joined by Praveen. Praveen, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me.
It is our pleasure to have you on the show today. We chatted a few weeks ago and I immediately found you quite an interesting character. So I'm really keen to have this discussion today. And I'd love to start where I start with all the guests, is just to hear a little bit more about yourself, because I think it helps our audience to understand who they're listening to today.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. So a little bit myself. I'm originally from India. I spent half my life in the States and in parts of Europe. From a education standpoint, I'm both an engineer and an applied mathematician, with some courses in management as well. And from a professional standpoint, I think most of my 20 years in the professional arena has been in and around data. That means that I started my career writing probabilistic and deterministic models in the financial services industry. Then I moved along, went into fintech, and then from that point in time, I started venturing out to doing things in and adjacent to data. What that means is not only data science or advanced analytics and what you have it in data, but also things such as project management, program management, managing data partnerships, setting up new revenue streams. So a few different things. And these different things were, some might say, slightly not normal or slightly abnormal to a typical data expert's career path. That said, I think that's enriched me um, in the form of understanding things from a more strategic perspective, or the business dynamics of things, programmatically trying to manage and orchestrate several factors that come in when we talk about data products, and so on and so forth. Spent some time in finance as well, so understanding P&Ls and OPEXs and balance sheets and so on and so forth. But all of those enrich me. The price of it would be that, because if I didn't mention that, we'd not be doing justice to it. I think the price of it is being a little removed from the, how should I say it, top of mind for a data professional would be things such as the metrics and how things work in terms of the various models and so on and so forth. So for me, while it's there, it's a little bit in the back of my head, right? It's there somewhere. It takes a little bit of time to come about, but it's there somewhere. That's the price that one pays, right? When you start diversifying and doing different things adjacent to, yeah.
As you say, you've been enriched by all these experiences, and I guess also enriched by the fact you've lived in so many different places in the world. And I wonder how that has helped you, how it's framed your view of the world.
Right. Good question, Tim. I think for me, life gave me opportunities to live and work in different parts of the world. Especially a company like eBay, PayPal. Back then, eBay and PayPal were together. So the eBay conglomerate helped me to not only be geographically diverse, but also be different, be diverse in terms of the business units and the type of functions that we work in. What I mean by that is, uh, example, I've lived in the US, in different parts of the US. I've lived in Switzerland for a little bit. I've lived in the Netherlands for the last several years, and I'm originally from India. So on the one side, there is a lot of cultural diversity that's baked into me, if you will. Um, and in terms of functions that I was talking about, it goes back to my earlier response about being doing things that are within the sphere of data as we know it today, as well as adjacent functions like um, finance, FP&A, some amount of accounting, balance sheet reviews, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And one string to your bow, if we can call it that, is that you teach and practice yoga and meditation. And I'd love to somehow draw a connection between learning that kind of mindfulness and your work and career and how it's kind of helped you in your work. And if we could somehow connect it to hiring after that, that would also be interesting.
Sure, Tim. It's the short answer is it's a journey. I haven't reached the destination yet. It's a journey, and mindfulness is about every moment, right? And being human, we still are subject to things such as anxiety and stresses, and ups and downs in terms of emotional waves or emotions, if you will. That said, I think practices that are in yoga and meditation, as well as in things such as Zen and other mindfulness practices, uh, I think, simply put, it's about being aware, aware every single moment. You try to be aware every single moment of your thought, word, and actions. I think that's the simplest thing. Being aware every moment about your thought, word, and actions. Now, easier said than done. It's a constant practice, which is why you have mindfulness meditations, you have mindfulness walking, you have so many different practices that try to inculcate mindfulness into our daily lives. How how does that help me in my career front? I think couple of things, and I don't think I'll be able to list them exhaustively. One of it is, like we talked about, mindfulness. Am I giving myself adequate distance between whatever the stimuli is and the reaction that I'm making, or the response that I have to any particular stimuli? And by stimuli, I mean people saying something or doing something, or a situation going awry, or a situation going that's unplanned or unforeseen, right? That is, again, a constant process. It's a journey, not a destination. But from that comes the ability to be more empathetic. And I don't claim that I've been empathetic all the time, every day, day in and day out, but it does help. Empathetic or having compassion to somebody else is somebody is having a bad day, so they're going to react differently. Doesn't mean that we have to have a squabble as a result of that. So those are a couple of examples or a couple of ways in which mindfulness or the practices of yoga and meditation that I do on a daily basis really helps.
I guess when it comes to then interviewing candidates, so you're saying let's focus on kind of being in the moment and really being present and being aware of ourselves, and then the empathy as well for the candidate. Getting a job is a very stressful thing. Interviewing is incredibly stressful, and so maybe that mindful state could it also almost be passed on to the candidates? I know I've heard of some people when they're saying, well, the first job is to make the candidate feel relaxed, so you have to feel relaxed. And I wonder if that's part of the trick.
Yes, I think you've said it really well. In any interaction, and in this case, an interview is a lot more stressful for one side more than the other, right? So any person being interviewed, the candidate is going to have the need to be put at ease by himself or herself, or by the person who's interviewing them, simply because they're anxious, or they're tense, or they're on the edge of the seat, whatever you have it. Now, empathy, how that helps is trying to break the ice in such a way that you make the candidate feel more comfortable. You make the candidate be able to access their own thoughts and their memories, right? Why I'm saying that about access is, when we get stressed, anxious, so on and so forth, we tend to lose our awarefulness or being in the moment, as the result of which things that we know very well over a long period of time also sometimes escape us, right? That immediate recall, that access to memory is affected because we have these fleeting emotions or shortness of breath as a result of being stressed out. Now, that's from an interviewer standpoint, right? Sometimes, or the candidate's standpoint. My apologies. But sometimes the interviewer is also stressed or nervous or something, because they've had a busy day, or they've had less time to prepare, or whatever you have it. So a lot of people say, break the ice, really well when there is the interview, and there is very good reason to it, so that that conversation flows very easily. That conversation is productive, and the right questions have the right responses, or the best responses that the candidate can give, given where she or he are in their career.
And if I think back to my own career, particularly my early career, the first jobs I was going for as a graduate way back were investment banking and management consulting, two notoriously difficult and kind of competitive industries to get into. Now, back then, I wouldn't say top of mind for them was making the candidate feel relaxed. If anything, it was deliberately being obnoxious and having like a stress interview to try to sort of freak you out and see how well you could maintain composure under stress. And I guess maybe their theory was it was kind of correlated to what you need to do on the job. If you're there in front of a CEO of a $100 billion company and you need to do some quick mental maths in your head, you have to do it. You can't kind of just melt away. So maybe there's some kind of method to the madness, but yeah, could you see any reason to advocate for like deliberately stressing out the candidates?
I think more than the stressor or the trigger for stress, what I've been trying to articulate here is how we deal with stress. Right? We rarely have control over the trigger or the stressor. What we do have control over is how we respond to it. That's why putting a certain amount of distance in real time between the action or or whatever you have it, the stress or the trigger, and one's response is super important. What does that mean? That means taking a deep breath, pausing, thinking about something before you're trying to respond to it, or just stepping back from this driver's seat and saying, hey, you know what, Tim's having a rough day, so this is what it is. Or you know what, Tim is being extra obnoxious today during this interview, so that he can push my button, so it's okay. I can see it happening, and I'm going to take a little bit of a gap and try to respond to this in a more poised fashion.
And so, and because this is a learning thing for myself at the moment as well, in general. So I'm trying to understand better people who are probably further along the journey than I am when it comes to this kind of thing. So part of the trick is to, in the moment, realize what's happening and some almost snap out. So you're sort of looking at yourself externally and you are detached from it in some sense. Is that part of it?
Yes, that is part of it. I think you've put it very succinctly, Tim. Yes, it is part of it. I have 2 points to say about that. One, the reason a lot of masters who are much more advanced have put this, or yoga masters, so on, say that it is important that you meditate early in the morning as soon as you wake up, or as soon as you're done with your morning routine, is so that we inculcate or develop the habit of being calm and poised, so that during the rest of the day we are able to stay that way, poised and calm. That's the first thing that I wanted to mention. The second thing I want to mention is there are different techniques for someone to extract themselves from that driver's seat, so that they give themselves gap. And you've seen a lot of people do this. Some people actually put their hands together and rub their fingertips. Some people have a rubber band around their wrist, and they're doing something, right? The applications of it are different, but in essence, what it's trying to do is it's trying to give yourself that gap. Obviously, the rubber band trick is not to inflict pain onto yourself, but it's just basically to stay aware and say, okay, fine, this is happening. Let me take a little bit of a gap and respond to it. Yeah.
Oh, it's a really interesting like mental trigger, a kind of mnemonic where you can sort of snap yourself out of it in a way that's really cool. I hadn't heard of that before. I'll have to get myself a rubber band, and maybe if it somehow had some personal meaning to me, maybe that would then resonate better. But that's, I don't know, the name of someone, a loved one, or something like that. Maybe then that would add an extra layer. I don't know.
Yeah, there are so many other things, right? You have the stress ball, for example. You have a couple of magnets that you find people are flicking through their fingers, or pens being twirled, pens or pencils being twirled, right? That's basically, yeah, you might think they're distracting themselves, but with the proper intent, it's not a distraction. It's actually getting yourself to be more aware.
Yes. Okay. And stick with the kind of theme of interviews. Okay, so we've spoken about making sure we have a nice, relaxed environment. Candidate is relaxed so they can access what's really in their brain and they're not having a freak out. That's essential. What about how do you think about? So actually, let me share a page from a book of a previous guest of ours, because this explains better what I'm trying to say. So there's a book called Humanizing Data Strategy by Tian Kai Feng. And he has on page 16, he has this spectrum. On the left side of the spectrum, he has experience based things. So there's no data. It's kind of more like intuition and gut feel. On the other side of the spectrum, he has data driven. And I often think of this spectrum when it comes to hiring and interviewing. Where do you fit? Like when you do your interviews, are you doing a structured thing where it's measured as much as you can, or is there some kind of intuitive element? And how do you think about this process?
Let's map it to the two hemispheres of our brain, okay? And all of us have different levels to which we lean on one hemisphere of the brain. So we have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and the right hemisphere deals with more of the left side of the body and the left on the right side of the body. So the left hemisphere, as we notice, has a lot more to do with logic, structures, so on and so forth. Whereas the right hemisphere, which is the left side of the body, the right hemisphere deals with a lot of the intuition and artistic, creative aspects of it. Now, as a result of our education, as a result of our conditioning and so on and so forth, we tend to access one hemisphere more than the other. Okay, and that's just natural. Some of us are more left, and some of us are more right-sided brain from a brain perspective. Uh, it's From my perspective, I think depending on a couple of factors. So let me talk about first being a candidate for an interview, and then as an interviewer, as a hiring manager. So you get both sides of the equation, right? Now, as a candidate for an interview, I tend to try to stay calm and answer the questions mostly from a logical, rational perspective, because I assume that the other person is having a structured thought process and has certain questions, and they have certain reasons for certain questions. So I'm trying to answer those questions in a logical and cogent manner. However, I am trying to access the creative aspects in my brain and the memory aspects, right? So sometimes it works flawlessly, and sometimes there are um, things where I might forget something because it's not over my mind, or I might misspeak something, right? Because of the switching back and forth. Uh, that's just the way it works for me. Okay. When I am the hiring manager, then I try to come in a lot more uh, from the creative side and the intuitive side, because even though I've prepared, I've read the candidate's profile, I understand their background to a certain extent, I understand what the job description is and what the requirements are. I'd like to get a good sense of how well this person will fit into the team or collaborate with the rest of the people, right? And collaboration is a lot more on the creative and intuitive side than it is on the logical side, um, the way I see it. So it's a mix. What I'm trying to say is, as a candidate, I try to be more logical and rational so I'm able to communicate with the other person. And as an interviewer, as a hiring manager, I try to be a little bit more on the intuitive side so that I am able to grasp what they're telling me logically and not stop at that, but also try to sense, is this person nervous? Does this person actually know it and has forgotten it, or does this person not know it? And how well the person can fit into it. So it's a mix, and it comes with practice over a period of time.
Yes. And so there's a sense of the sort of intuition bit almost being more like experience anyway, because you must have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of candidates over the years for many, many different roles. Uh, and is there a structured element? Like, do you end up having a scorecard for candidates? Are you trying to grade them across different soft skills, hard skills, values? Does it? Do you get a number at the end of the day, or something else? Or what would you recommend?
It's a mix of both. And as a hiring manager, what I tend to do is give 3 to 5 maximum number of skills that we want to rate someone. Okay, 3 to 5 max. Um, it's a mixture of number as well as commentary on the person, right? Why this? Because as humans, we get a lot of information when we interact with somebody else, and putting that down as a number doesn't do justice to it, because there are certain comments, or there is a certain commentary that goes along with someone's story or someone's thought process, and so on and so forth. So, long story short, there are 3 to 5 dimensions which you can partly fill in by numbers, but also with the commentary saying why or why not, or hey, this person's better suited for another role within the team, or whatever you may have it. The last thing I want to say there is, as much as many people would like things to be black and white, things aren't, right? And if we are going to navigate the gray areas, we do need to give ourselves room to be able to navigate said gray areas.
Do you think there's a I think that the grayness could be faded away and be more black and white if we measured more things well. And the part of the solution to the grayness is just better measurement of stuff. So that, if you get to the end of an interview and you still have some kind of gut feel about the candidate one way or another, if you just kind of meditated on and spoke through what you're thinking, probably you could come up with some kind of objective criteria. You could go back and measure them along. Am I onto something, or is there still just going to be this inherent element that is we can't put effort into?
No, I agree with you, Tim. I think there's quite a bit of that gray area that we can try and rationalize and quantify. But there, in my experience, there is still some gray area that will be left at the end. We can reduce it, but we cannot make it go away. That's just the way we are. That's just the way we are designed. That's just the way. For example, the best example I can give you is, ultimately, when it comes down to making a hiring decision, and what I have seen, most hiring managers tend to make an intuitive call about a candidate as compared to others, right? It goes beyond looking at the CVs and knowing what they are, and rating them and scorecarding them, if you will. But ultimately, it comes down to, I feel this person will be a uh, yeah, better fit for this.
And I myself have even done that, and I run a podcast called the Objective Hiring Show, and skills assessment platform. So I would be like anyone else. I sometimes think I should be saved from myself though, and that my weakness is just to hire people that I like. I'm like, I really got along with this person. I could tell you, if I ever have a candidate in the first 5 minutes we're chatting about football, all right, and they're really passionate about football, and we're talking about the Champions League this morning or something, straight away they're already 3 levels above anyone else, and I have to sort of offset my at least my known bias in that case to come back to rationality. But I wonder if there's other things I'm not even thinking about that I'm unaware of that leads me down the wrong path potentially. What do you think?
Yeah, there is this framework, and I forget who came up with the framework, but it breaks down biases into conscious bias, unconscious bias, and it gives us tools to be able to overcome them, right? Again, I'm not professing that by doing this, we'd be totally bias free. We try to reduce the amount of bias in our decision making and in our navigating our day to day life. We try to reduce the bias, so that it's more rational, or it's more, it don't make sense, or it feels right. But all those answers come with certain bias. We try to minimize it, and which is why I go back to saying, okay, let's look at that conscious bias or unconscious bias, and make sure we can correct for it to a certain extent. And that's the skill part, right? But there also needs to be the will part. The will part of it is, am I okay just making decisions and not be conscious that I have a bias to begin with, or am I willing to look at things differently? And with that, I can address one other thing that you made a nice point. You said you'd like to hire someone who's very much like you, and that's fine. Um, uh, 2 pieces of response. All 5 fingers of our palm aren't the same, and there is a reason for that. There is a utility. Okay, that's just a simple and anecdotal, funny, semi-funny kind of response to it. But the other thing is, when there are different approaches to solving a problem applied by different people on the team, right? Then the probability of finding a solution is higher than if everyone thinks the same way of solving said problem.
Yes, and I heard another guest describe this to me. That his view was that, okay, you have this kind of diversity of thought and mindset. Your odds of getting to the right destination are improved, even though it may take a little bit longer, because inherently there's going to be more debate, a bit of back and forth, as opposed to just having this myopic view where you might just go fly straight to the mountain. Uh, in interviews, we've talked about the kind of structured, unstructured approaches. Uh, One thing I always found difficult as an interviewer was trying to, you know, focus on what the candidate's saying, figure out what I'm going to ask them, take notes on what they've said, also start to almost make a decision in my head, score them, etc. Like it's a cognitively complex thing to be an interviewer and interviewee, I think. Uh, but there's now AI note taking apps that get used for all sorts of meetings that I think personally are a no brainer in interviews because it could at least park one of those things off to the AI to do the summary, to do the transcription, to go, oh, yeah, the candidate did say that, to be a better memory than what we ever would be. Uh, have you used any kind of tool like that in interviews yet? Do you think they should be used?
No, I haven't used a transcription feature or a feature that will allow me to offload some of the activity. Then I see where you're going with this, and I understand how some of it can be offloaded. But short answer, I have not used it. Now, if I were to respond to, does it make sense, and do you think it is of use for us in this process? I think so. I think so, because then it allows the hiring manager to actually focus more on the response and how the person is conducting themselves, and is the person having a challenge in trying to, say, for example, remembering something right from the past, or trying to connect the dots and really try to understand what question was asked. So then it's a more active and engaging conversation, rather than you ask me a question, Tim, and I'm responding, and you're making notes frantically, and you're missing out on as a simple thing as say me smiling at you or me telling you a joke, or whatever you have it, right? So yes, there is a balance that we need to strike. We can use it. There needs to be a balance, and that means that the hiring manager has the responsibility of being prepared before going in and knowing what tools and what value comes out of it. Bottom line, ultimately the hiring manager and the stakeholders or whoever is on the panel, right, they get to make that decision. The question is, are they being equipped well enough to take that decision effectively? That's the maximum value of that.
I am guessing that these interviews will be recorded, will be transcribed, and that will become a normal thing pretty soon, I think. And I think they'll just be like AI just kind of edging into the hiring process gradually, gradually, gradually. Because once it's in there in the interview and it's done the recording, and it's done the transcription, surely the next step is like, oh, well, here's the scorecard for the interview. How did you think the candidate went across these dimensions? I personally think there's huge upside because of the things we're talking about, which is the bias, which is even, how many times would you have had an interview with two interviewers and you go away and do, if people do this, do like your own separate scorecard, and then you come back, you're like, oh, wow, you gave them a 3 out of 10. I gave them an 8 out of 10. Like, why? And so maybe it's just even an extra opinion from the AI superhuman, amazing super being might be helpful to the equation. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think at the I agree with you, Tim. um, the very basic thing, any AI model or machine learning model, if you will, is trained over a period of time, right? It's trained on the various data sets and however you cut it. Now, it can be a supervised learning model, it can be an unsupervised learning model, whatever, but it needs to be trained. Now, that model, as it gets more and more trained, it gets more and more intelligent, right? And that's what AI is going through. Many of us have used a large language model and had chats with it and say, okay, fine, I've already given you this information. Why don't you access that and answer this new query that I have? That's it. Some of it is it's designed to do that automatically. Why I'm saying that now is that model, once it creeps in more and more to the hiring process, is going to be more effective and intelligent uh, to help in that decision making. It is also going to get biases. This is just a normal process. Like ultimately, the AI model is being written by humans, and we tend to pass on our rationality or the way we rationalize things to it. So as long as we're able to correct for that, and clearly define what kind of inputs we expect from the model, how much of the how much of the nuances that the model has we are able to live with, and what kind of recommendation we are going to leverage from the model, it's okay. Ultimately, it's a tool, right? We're using the tool to best um, help us resolve a question. So we need to know clearly what the limitations of it, and what value comes out of it. I think with that, we can really improve the way we hire, or at least interview and make a decision. The actual hiring process, I think the pre-interview, all that selection, we can talk about in a second.
Yes, indeed we can. And I've spoken to a lot of people about the screening step because that's where the highest volume is. This is where the companies are getting hundreds or even thousands of applicants. I personally feel like if we can improve the accuracy of that step by even a bit, that's going to have such a big impact. If we can reduce bias there even a little bit, that's going to have a big impact. And I have spoken to a few companies that have started using some kind of LLM pipeline they've built to then do some kind of resume grading and matching, but only a couple. Like it doesn't seem widespread at all yet. Have you tried to dabble with any of these tools yourself? And where do you think that kind of screening step is going with AI?
Sure. So um, any ATS is a very rudimentary form of an AI, very rudimentary, because it's trying to read. It's a machine learning. It's a how shall I put it in a very simplistic format? Um, it reads the text from the CVs that go in, and tries to put it into different categories in terms of work X and skills and so on and so forth, right? So it then tries to classify that, and then tries to cluster the candidates into ones that are more qualified for this job or less qualified for this job, or somewhere in between, right? So any ATS is a very rudimentary form of such a model. It has its limitations, and we all know that. Uh, but it is set up to help the job of a recruiter as well as a hiring manager, right? So it's a tool which is set up to help them, but it has its limitations. So if you take one step further, you take one step back, um, the 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 roles need to be defined very clearly by the hiring manager and the recruiter, and they both should really understand what is needed in order for anyone to be successful in the role, as an individual contributor or as a team lead, or a functional lead, and so on and so forth, right? Are we really clear as to what the requirements are? uh, there is no such thing as a perfect candidate, okay? um, and and making sure we really understand that a candidate who is able to do the job to a certain extent, as they hit the ground running, and then that candidate should be able to evolve as the needs of that job evolve, because no job is static. Okay. The job, the company's challenges, the questions that are being asked, or the problems that are being trying to be solved, they're all evolving, so they're dynamic. So there is a part of it where you look at the history of the candidate and say, for this role, do they fit X percentage, and obviously in the majority side, right? And then there is another part, which is how much of a growth mindset do they have, or how quickly are they able to learn, and how well do they collaborate with other people, or different functions, and so on and so forth, whatever you have it, right, depending on the role. I think once we have a clear idea of that, and not fully, and not always lean on, say, the technical aspects only for any role, then we, as a hiring manager and a recruiter, have a good idea, and our success rate is going to be better, because now we have an adaptable process. The AI then can really help us us do that process a lot more effectively and efficiently. I'll tell you why in a very short form, right? You find a lot of roles out there, and hundreds and thousands of people apply for it. But any market, for a particular role, you might not have that many qualified candidates. So how can we reduce that? Obviously, with an AI tool. Obviously, we're trying to say, are we clear with the requirements, and have we articulated that clearly to the job board or LinkedIn or wherever you have it. And and thirdly, the duration for which that posting is there, right? So if you want to make a decision, let's not have it for 3 months. Let's not have the posting out there for 3 months. Let's talk about more in terms of a turnaround time of 1 week or 2 weeks, right? You have that posting out there for a week or two. Mention clearly on the posting that it's, the deadline date is by this, and then you can run that process a lot more orchestrated, not lot well orchestrated, right? A lot better, if you will. There's a fourth point to that. I want to make a mention, because if I don't, we'd not be doing justice to it. Of late, there have been a lot of fake job postings on various job boards, right? For various reasons. Um, there is fraudulent activity behind it. Some of the fraudulent activity is people who are building ghost databases of candidates in any market. Uh, Without getting into the ethical debate of it right now, Tim, I wanted to make mention of this thing happening, because you find a lot of roles that are sitting around. You find hundreds and thousands sometimes candidates applying to said roles, and it's time and effort. And when the process is not run properly, then not only is the candidate's time being wasted, the hiring team's time is also wasted, and ultimately the brand value of the organization is being affected. Okay. And from that fourth point I made about these fake postings being around, it is it is muddying the waters. It is making this hiring process and job search process even more of a pain than it already is.
Well, this is definitely something we should get into a bit more detail of, because yes, it's not a candidate friendly market, and we should help them in any way we can. So you're saying that there's a spike in fake jobs driven by what, like some kind of recruitment startups trying to build up this model of candidates and build up their own unique data sets? Or is it more traditional companies that have just got fake jobs because they're pipelining for future roles? Or well, what have you heard and seen?
What I've fact based, what I've heard and read about this, heard in the sense read about it, um, it's a mix of those two and a third thing. So, yes, you have large companies who want to build a pipeline, and they may or may not have that job sanctioned by the finance teams or whatever you have. Then you have these recruiting agencies or recruiting teams or recruiting startups who want to build this pipeline of potential candidates, because as soon as a thing pops up, an opening pops up, they have a thing that they have a list of candidates who they can push. Again, I'm not going to get into the ethics of it. That's a much longer conversation. What I'm saying is that's happening. That's the second thing, and the third thing is there are a lot of scams that are happening where people are being approached by people who call themselves as recruiters and try to get information, personal information, bank information, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah, we might think, oh, why would you do that? Why would you give that? There are people who are struggling, who are in dire need, and who think that by doing that it gets them ahead in the job market. And it's that piece that's being what's the word? I'm looking for the right word. um, that's the piece that's being preyed upon by many scamsters, right? Fraudsters, if you will. So there are three aspects there.
Well, for that last category, I mean, these people are scoundrels. That is absolutely shocking. And they should hang their head in shame, I think, if that's what's going on. Uh, yeah, and I'm not sure how AI can help us solve that. I feel like, if anything, uh, AI might enable them to run their scams at a greater scale, potentially.
I think it can work both ways, Tim. I think an AI tool can really help screen out such fake posts, right? You can put in a certain amount of diligence or rigor into whatever post is being before it gets before it gets published on whatever website, right? Whatever job board, before it gets published there is a certain amount of vetting that needs to be done. Is this legit? Is this coming from a company or person or whatever you have it, right? Or recruiting company, whatever you have it, certain amount of rigor that needs to be there in that process. I don't think that's there right now. I think the model is more about um, You can use this job board and pay this much to list these many listings. And and then there's the other thing, many people forget to delist it once they've made the decision, and you find roles that are sitting there for 3 months, 6 months. Then maybe those roles actually can't get hired, can't find the right hire. Maybe you shouldn't be hiring for those roles. I don't know.
Yeah, someone mentioned to me a metric the other day that I would love to have access to, and that is of all the advertisements that are placed, what proportion of those jobs actually get filled by a person? And we would be horrified at how low it is because you've just laid out three or four permutations of bullshit that happens. But then there's also just the roles that get pulled. Like I even know myself from working in recruitment is like you get to the 11th hour and suddenly it's like, no, we don't have the budget for this anymore. Our new plans come out for the quarter. We're cutting this role. That happens all the time, which seems bizarre to me that you couldn't forecast a few months into the future to know whether or not you're going to hire someone. And you'd run an entire hiring process with 10 interviews and 8 candidates and the hiring manager and everything. And they go, oh, we're not going to need it. That seems like you could have avoided that, I reckon.
It goes back to the fact that the environment is dynamic, right? So approaching it from a very static position in terms of the process, in terms of requirements, um, is perhaps not the most effective way of resolving it.
You mentioned previously that for an AI or even without AI in hiring, you really need to think ahead of hiring what skills you're after and what you really need. I personally feel like a lot of hiring processes I've seen derail into failure pretty quickly have had that lack of forethought. But then you've also said, well, actually, sometimes it is a bit of a febrile dynamic scenario where you have to kind of adjust on the fly. Uh, but yeah, in your experience, like what should the hiring manager really be thinking about from the get go? What is and maybe does anything fall into the category of, oh, you can figure this out on the fly? Like,
Yeah, I think so. I think, and I'm guilty of making this mistake sometimes. Okay, but it's not only about filling a an open role. Okay, uh, it's about adding a member to the team. It's about adding a member to the organization, to its culture, to whatever you have it, right. You're adding a person, a candidate, whatever you call it, a person or an entity to this already existing entity, team or organization. Now you're going to be looking at very clearly what they're going to bring to the job in terms of their technical skills, but also in terms of their other softer skills, whatever you call it, right? Project management, collaboration, cross-functional collaboration, strategic thinking, whatever you have it. Now, are we clear on one, what are the requirements as of today? And most hiring managers want to make a hire for a long period of time, right? Someone who is with the organization for a long period of time. So, do we think, or have we done the thinking around how is that person, or at least how is that role going to evolve in the next year or two to the best of our ability, right? There are many things that we don't know. Based on that, there's one which is static, which is as of today, and then the other one is more dynamic, right? So, have we done the diligence around clarifying what the role looks like, or what the ideal candidate might look like, and how well they're going to fit in with the rest of the team? That is super important as a hiring manager. Then that hiring manager needs to communicate that or articulate that clearly to, one, the recruiter, and two, the other people who are going to be involved in that panel of making the decision. I have personally, earlier in my career, made the decision of keeping that all in my head, or doing less of that diligence. And then learning that, what, if I really want to make my team more successful and add more value to the organization, I need to do this effort, and really hone that, or clarify that job description, and the way we need to go about that process. Does that answer your question, Tim?
it certainly does. And you mentioned something I think really essential there, which is sharing that with other people, because inevitably you're not the only one involved in the process. And I can vividly remember certain hiring processes I was involved with where it was actually a pretty reasonable scope. Like we knew what we were looking for, candidates getting through stage 1, 2, 3 very, very well. And then in comes Johnny come lately, stage 4 interviewer with their own idea of the role that is completely disconnected from everyone else. and they come in with this bit of feedback, oh, the candidate doesn't have X, or they really need Y, and X and Y were never part of the brief to begin with. And so everyone has to be on the same page, don't they?
Yeah, Tim, I think many of us have had a similar experience. I'll respond to that with just one thing, right? The way our critical thinking works is we tend to identify the gaps first, right? So that's a bias that we have, a bias in terms of where it's like finding a door. You go and search for a door because there is a gap between two walls, and that's the door. Simple example, very oversimplified, but the way our critical thinking works is to find those gaps. But in the hiring process, it needs to be done the other way around, right? We need to see what candidates bring to the table, and do they add up to, I don't know, 70, 80% or 90% of what we're looking for? There's no one who's going to be 100, 110, 120% to that role, right? So let's be realistic there. Let's be clear about it, and let's articulate that clearly, both in the job description as well as to the recruiter and the hiring panel.
And so, just so I understood correctly, so let's say you have a job and the requirements, and you have a candidate and their skills and ability, and some kind of crossover Venn diagram thing. And it is part of what you're saying that you can adjust the job somewhat to suit the candidate once you see them, to kind of leverage more of the skills that they have that you weren't even thinking about? Or would you still keep the job as is and just try to find the candidate that matches the job?
I'll put it this way: not in the initial stages of the interview will you change the job description based on the candidate. In your final three, if you've gone through the process, in the final three or final four, whatever you have, right? In the final set of candidates, when you're trying to make a decision, then there needs to be some sort of flexibility, some sort of adaptability there. That adaptability will obviously grow over a period of time during the process, right? Because you realize certain things, or certain things have evolved in terms of the problem statements that role is going to try and solve. That's what I'm trying to say. You don't have to change it right in the beginning. Obviously, towards the end, you'll see, okay, who is the best suited candidate for this role? And you needn't have to start this entire process all over again because our job description is set in stone.
Yeah, and that's a great way to get the most out of the person you ultimately hire. And it's good to be a bit flexible. Uh, Praveen, if you could ask our next guest one question, any question about hiring, what would you choose to ask them?
Yes. Um, I'd ask them, irrespective of the specific role, right? A data scientist is going to have certain different skill sets as compared to a data engineer and so on and so forth. So, irrespective of that specificity, right? What is the one or maybe two key skills that you look for in any candidate, that is going to be a top of your list, or a successful candidate? What does that successful candidate have as one or two skills, other than the technical things, that you think will make them successful?
That's a great question, and one that will go into one of our episodes next week. And I'm going to take a guess at what they're going to answer based on the data I've seen so far. I reckon there's at least a 50% chance they'll say something along the lines of learning new stuff quickly, growth mindset, something in that space. That's what I predict they're going to say. How would you answer that question if you got asked that?
I'd agree there. I think someone who's agile in learning, right? So the growth mindset. None of us are perfect, so we're going to make mistakes. We're going to learn. So how willing are we to learn? That growth mindset is number one. Secondly, is I think collaboration, right? How amiable are you to work with others? How amiable are you to like we said, learn from others, adapt, work with them, and then ultimately add value to the team and the organization, right? I think those are the two things that really matter.
I would second that, and that's certainly what we look for. Praveen, it's been a great conversation today. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with our audience today.
Thank you so much, Tim. Glad to have been a part of this. Take care.